What are some of the main differences that you would see with someone with ADHD versus a neurotypical person?
Yeah, there's a brilliant scientist called Volkow who's done a lot of research into this and the amount of dopamine the brain generates. And humans have what's called baseline dopamine, which is the amount we're all naturally generating at any given moment, regardless of the activity we're interacting with. And with ADHD individuals, you're producing slightly lower levels of dopamine within the brain at any given moment. And it means that given dopamine's function is kind of motivation and concentration and your attention span, it means it's a little bit harder to get yourself into those states where you're productive and where you're laser focused. But it also means if you get into there, because you can experience these really big increases, you can be hyperfocused and get really motivated. But there's a difficulty kind of getting yourself in the zone with ADHD.
Today I'm joined by neuroscientist, international speaker and author of The Dose Effect, TJ Power. TJ's work is all about optimizing our brain chemistry. Now, we previously spoke with Mark Manson about impulsivity and novelty, and today I wanted to discuss with TJ why it is that us ADHDers operate a little differently when it comes to dopamine. TJ, welcome to Cloud.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
So what initially got you interested in psychology and neuroscience?
I think trying to understand my own brain was definitely a big driving factor. I played really high-level golf when I was a young kid and had like a sports psychologist super young. And that kind of opened my eyes to, okay, I've got like a brain and there's like some kind of psychology going on in my brain. And then throughout my teenage years, I struggled a lot with alcohol and cigarettes and porn and social media and stuff like that. And decided to start studying psychology because it was a subject I found most interesting when I was at school and college. And then the desire to kind of solve my own brain's challenges led me to go deeper and deeper into the research.
I guess if you ended up having some problems with, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, whatever, do you think that that's because you had such a disciplined upbringing of the golfing and you weren't really able to do anything in the naughty realm?
Potentially. It was interesting. I got to about 14 years old and I was at a good level. Like that was the career I was hoping to go down. And then went to my first few parties at a new school and discovered getting pissed and talking to girls and all that kind of dopamine-y stuff. And very rapidly lost my desire for that clean golfing career life and moved towards a different pursuit, which has worked out. Okay, I'm happy with where things have ended up. But yeah, it could have been a bit of a rebound effect from over-discipline.
Maybe, and the dopamine high is not quite as high just doing a putt.
Yeah, definitely the bottle of vodka can take you to a different place.
100%. So when it comes to dopamine, what are some of the main differences that you would see with someone with ADHD versus a neurotypical person?
Yeah, there's a brilliant scientist called Volkow who's done a lot of research into this and the amount of dopamine the brain generates. And humans have what's called baseline dopamine, which is the amount we're all naturally generating at any given moment, regardless of the activity we're interacting with. And with ADHD individuals, you're producing slightly lower levels of dopamine within the brain at any given moment. And it means that given dopamine's function is kind of motivation and concentration and your attention span, it means it's a little bit harder to get yourself into those states where you're productive and where you're laser focused. But it also means if you get into there, because you can experience these really big increases, you can be hyper-focused and get really motivated. But there's a difficulty kind of getting yourself in the zone with ADHD.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we've mentioned a couple of times on this podcast that there's something about the name ADHD and, having deficit in the title and having disorder in the title as well. Like, and I've wondered whether I feel this way because in a way it could be me protecting my ego about it and kind of being like, I don't have a deficit. I just have a difference in the way that I operate. But knowing what dopamine can do in your brain and knowing how it can relate so much to so many of the symptoms of ADHD, I like to think of it as a different way that we do process dopamine. And that's kind of why we may struggle with certain things. But just like you said, the hyperfocus is something that a lot of people with ADHD, they really enjoy and they're able to be really productive people, really good workers, and really good friends if the topic of conversation is quite interesting.
Yeah, I just want to add on this disorder piece because that isn't the most lovely thing to be told, you've got a disorder. I grew up with OCD as a young kid and I didn't like the idea of being told I had a disorder. And arguably with my OCD, it's actually become quite useful as I became able to manage it in terms of being very ordered and structured. And with the research lab, it's very helpful having that structure. With this idea of disorder, if you were to look at how humans were evolving as hunter-gatherers. All of our research is built on this idea that we spent 300,000 years running around in a forest. We spent like 30 years as these modern sedentary sit on phones all day humans. And if you were looking at our ancestors and when they were evolving, if someone was born with genetically lower dopamine production and they had ADHD, as we would describe it now, when that hunter-gatherer was growing up, they would get to 8, 9, 10 years old and they would be asked to do stuff within that tribe, make the fire, build the shelter, forage for food, hunt for food. And they would have gone out there and engaged with that behavior and actually experienced a greater increase in dopamine than the rest of the tribe. They would have been experiencing a huge amount of pleasure from making the fire or building the shelter or hunting. And they would have actually probably become better at it than the rest of the group because of how enjoyable they found the experience of the activity. And it's very likely that from a hunter-gatherer perspective, our world was actually built off people with ADHD. Like those people would have been the ones creating the optimum conditions for survival for that group. So where in the modern world ADHD is difficult because you're trying to fit into the box that modern society has created, evolutionarily those with ADHD would have effectively been imperative to our survival as a species.
Did you hear that, neurotypical people? We carried you lot, okay?
You carried us.
Can I ask, are you open to talking about your experiences of OCD?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so when did you first start showing symptoms of that?
I was actually super young. I was like 5, 6 years old, and I had difficulties with like creating scenarios in my brain and then believing them to be true. So I'd be like lying in bed and I would have this idea in my head that if I didn't go out to the garage in the middle of the night and turn a light switch on and off 5 times, then something bad would happen to my family. And that becomes like the obsessive part of the OCD, and then you have obsessive compulsive disorder. If I successfully went and hit that light switch, which I did, you then come to believe that doing it helped my family not get into danger. So then you create a loop. And
it's like confirmation bias.
Yeah, it's like a confirmation.
Yeah.
And my brain was so young, it got really into these loops. And my mum had OCD when she was young, so she quite like understood what I was going through. And she very smartly didn't actually get me diagnosed with OCD super young because I was so young that it might have become worse as a result of a diagnosis at like that 6, 7 years old. So she told me I was going to kind of like brain training as a young kid, and that it was actually because I was extra clever. That's how she kind of created it in my brain. And I would sit there, and they did help me a lot to ease that experience and develop the ability to not compulsively act on the obsession within my mind.
That's really interesting because a lot of people that are diagnosed with ADHD, often they will be diagnosed with something else alongside it, whether it be anxiety, OCD, depression, a bit of a mix of a few. And I think it's just really interesting when we get into the nitty-gritty of how certain neurochemicals can affect certain brain regions and the behaviors that are then presented because of it.
For sure.
And it wouldn't surprise me if in the future we found out that, these things were very interconnected, and there was a reason that when you're diagnosed with one thing, it's often that there can be symptoms of other things as well.
Definitely. And it's really important to understand that with us as humans, we have the ability to communicate. We have language to communicate with one another right now. In your body, you have your nervous system, and effectively these neurochemicals are the language. They are the communication system around your nervous system. So dopamine is talking and serotonin is talking and oxytocin and so on. And with something like ADHD, OCD, autism, your neurochemicals are all chatting to one another, and there's often a lot of comorbidity between these challenges because if one thing is off, something else might be slightly off, and they can kind of play into one another. And you could see that as a challenge, or you could see that as my brain is different just to how the neurotypical brain is, but it also is enhanced in a variety of ways. And learning to understand exactly what you're going through and live your lifestyle in the best way to optimize your chemicals can then really change the experience you have.
Absolutely. And I really love how your mum rephrased that for you. Kids who are growing up with ADHD, they experience a lot more criticism of their behaviors. And I think a lot of us connect that with a sense of morality, like I'm not as good of a person because I forget things and I interrupt people and I seem a bit scattered and people think I'm disinterested. Like reframing that narrative of you're just a little bit different and we're going to go to brain camp because you're really intelligent and you're really good at something.
She fooled me, but it worked.
I bet, like it's so worked. And I think it's such a nice way to kind of positively reshape that experience, especially for kids growing up.
I really think it's important because when you're really young, you're really like vulnerable to other people's perceptions. We all are as humans, but when you're really young, especially as you go into teenage years, people's opinions of you matter so much. And we work a lot in schools. I go and deliver big like live experiences in schools, and we've actually begun renaming ADHD for these young people to ADHA and making it attention deficit hyperactivity ability. And these kids listen, they're like, what? I have ability. I've been told I'm like got this disorder. And I had a nice experience with a young girl that came up to me the other day. She was like 10, 11 years old. And she was like, what? So I have an ability. And I was like, yeah, you do. You have an ability. You can get really good at things. You can get really focused on things, even more than others can. And I was asking her, like, what is it that you like doing? Like, what do you find fun? What do you find really engages your brain and gets you into like a flow state, like into deep concentration? And she said to me, digital art. She loved like drawing on an iPad. And I was like, that's so cool. And she didn't really feel like she had enough time to do her digital art because like the pressures of school, even at 10 years old, putting so much stuff that you have to do, which is kind of insane, to be honest. And I said to her, just for the week I'm at your school training you, feel like you don't have to do any of your school stuff and just do your digital art for a week. And
the teachers love that.
The school would probably kill me for doing that. But I was thinking she's 10 years old. Like, it's okay. And she came back to me a week later, like we do one event a week. And she was so buzzing. She was so happy and so exciting. She was like, can I show you my digital art? And she came up to me and she had done the most insane drawings I'd ever seen. Like I literally couldn't believe a young kid could draw like that. And she was so happy and so fulfilled that she had prioritized that. And she had said like she'd been talking to her mum and dad and they were happy for her to do more of that in the evenings and stuff. And for those with ADHD, reframing it to I have an ability and then figuring out what that ability might be is super important, but hard to figure out the ability. Because I think this is one of the hard things for ADHD is you can be told you've got a superpower and stuff, but then it's like, well, I don't know what the hell my superpower is. So that's not that useful.
And I almost feel as though that can be a little, it's the same with purpose. You know, when you talk about work-life purpose and people who are like, well, I don't know what my purpose is. Like,
100%.
You know, and now I feel even worse than what I did beforehand, before we had the conversation about
then
purpose.
You think I really have no purpose.
Yes.
And you could have multiple superpowers for sure. There could be a multitude of things that you could be particularly good at. Things that effectively for you provide dopamine. That's how your superpower will lie. Like it will lie in an area for that young girl. Digital art gave her a big increase in dopamine. If you took another ADHD kid that loves like playing outside, they might find digital art really boring. So it wouldn't create dopamine for them. We really have tried to figure out this idea of how can someone identify in a nice, easy way what their thing might be. And I'm very interested in this idea of flow state, which is where your brain gets really hyper-focused on a task. And that's really what we want to try and enter more as modern human beings. We spend our life in this like quick dopamine distraction world. If you get hyper-focused on something, whether it's cleaning or art or music or sport, whatever it might be, in that state, your brain is generating a lot of natural dopamine. And I had this interesting experience. I have a friend of mine called Zach, and he's very ADHD. It's very clear visually that he's ADHD, and he's very cool about that. And he's super addicted to social media. And this is a couple of years ago, I had this moment with him, and he's super addicted to scrolling Instagram Reels to the point where he basically can't even interact with me without also having Instagram Reels, like scrolling almost in the background at the same time. And when he stays over, like if I wake up, like he'll always be scrolling it. And I was asking him, like, what is your favorite thing to scroll on social media? Like, what's the video you like seeing in your feed the most? And he was saying, I love the cooking videos. I think the cooking videos are awesome. I like watching them go and shop for it, cook the food, eat the food. He loves the whole experience of the cooking area of Instagram Reels. And I then asked him the question, like, how often are you cooking? Like, how often are you putting loads of time into making meals? And he was like, I just eat microwave meals. I don't even do any cooking. And what's effectively happening in our modern world is we're all watching someone else engage with our superpower on social media. So we're not bothering to actually do it ourselves. And if you carefully observe your social media feed over a few days and observe what is actually appearing most frequently, the reason that thing is appearing most frequently is because it's stimulating your dopamine, and actually engaging with the behavior would also stimulate your dopamine like crazy. Like that young girl, naturally digital art videos would have started appearing in her feed if she had a social media account because it's an innate interest. And if you start doing that, you start thinking, could I actually engage with this nature activity or creating music or singing or something to do with your work, whatever it might be, more often and naturally build it? And instead of watching people do their flow state, you do your flow state. That's like a real solution to finding it.
What would be the difference in the dopamine levels that you experience? You know, if we use your friend's example, you know, your friend Zach watching a video of cooking versus cooking, what, like chemically, what would happen with dopamine?
Yeah, so when you're watching the cooking, effectively with dopamine, it works as these things called vesicles in your brain. They're like these little bubbles in your brain that are created, that are manufactured. They build dopamine. And when you're watching social media videos, a huge amount of those bubbles are traveling across the synapse, like a really rapid stimulation of dopamine is happening. And that happens because of how quickly the videos are changing and how stimulating the videos and all the ASMR and so on. Like all this stuff is really rapidly making those dopamine bubbles transfer across the synapse. So when you're watching it, it's like, wow, this is really, really pleasurable. But because so many cross the synapse during the period you're watching, after watching, you're really depleted. You don't have many of those bubbles left in your brain, and it can leave you in that kind of flat, depleted, can't be bothered to do anything type feeling. In the scenario where someone's cooking, they're also generating these bubbles, but they're transferring really slowly across the synapse. And because they're transferring slower, your brain can constantly replenish them. So it's creating pleasure, but it's not going to leave you feeling crappy afterwards. It's actually going to leave you feeling really rewarded after the experience. And the more we pursue the idea of slow dopamine bubble creation rather than really fast dopamine bubble creation, the more fulfilled we feel, the more satisfied we feel. And that's like a good feeling. We desire that feeling as a human.
Something I've heard you talk about that I was like, oh, I haven't actually heard of that spoken about before is anticipatory dopamine.
Anticipatory dopamine is wild, and it's really impacting modern society. Obviously, we have this idea of like you scroll TikTok or you watch porn or you drink alcohol, and we know that's a dopamine behavior. That's become quite common knowledge now in our modern world. Effectively, dopamine isn't just created when we engage with the behavior. It can actually be created just at the thought of the behavior itself. And with that scenario, like if you walk past a bar and you see people drinking a glass of rosé, you might have this like, oh, I want a glass of rosé. And you get this like excitement simply at the thought of it. And then that drives you towards the bar to drink the rosé. And as we were evolving, anticipatory dopamine was so good because say I was feeling really tired and I couldn't really be bothered to do anything. And then I saw another few guys in the tribe saying, we're going out hunting. I would get this anticipatory dopamine of like, oh, wow, I should engage with that behavior as well. So that I go hunt, so that I also provide food for the group. So it was a very useful mechanism. But now in our modern world, we've got so many things like seeing someone pick up a phone and then we get anticipatory dopamine. Then we're like, oh, I have to pick up my phone. And that's why you're sitting in a restaurant with your partner and they go on theirs. And then before you've even thought about it, yours is just open and Instagram's open in your hand. And it's this world we're living in now where there's so much dopamine that we're seeing, it's creating more desire for us all to then engage with it as well, which is wild.
That is so interesting. There's a lot of anecdotal stories about people with ADHD. We can sometimes struggle with executive functioning and like task initiation.
Yeah.
It's like once the ball's rolling, we are absolutely fine. You know, there's kind of this narrative with ADHD and it exists a lot across social media. And I don't know how backed by science it is, but it's something that I am trying to disagree with. You know, they say, oh, if you've got ADHD, once you get home, don't take your shoes off, don't sit down. Because once you get down, you will not get back up. Like we kind of struggle with those, I guess, going from one task to another. And I guess that it might actually have a lot to do with anticipatory dopamine because once, like I said, once that ball is rolling, it's so easy to keep going. And we're like, whoa, cool. All right, we're on the ride now. Let's keep going. But just getting that initiation of the task seems to be something that we quite struggle with.
When you say get the ball rolling, that literally is what's happening in the brain in terms of these dopamine bubbles. Like you've got this store of dopamine in your hypothalamus, and then the dopamine wants to leave there and cross the synapse as you begin to engage with something that's effortful, some kind of activity. And with a neurotypical brain, say they're like, oh, I should get up off the sofa and go for a walk because those are good for me. They think about that idea, okay, I should go for a walk. And then dopamine very quickly starts leaving the hypothalamus and going across the synapse. So motivation increases and they're suddenly out there on the walk. With someone with ADHD, they have that thought of, oh, I should do this healthy behavior. I should do cleaning. I should go cook. I should go to the supermarket, whatever it may be. But the dopamine vesicles don't travel along. The ball doesn't start rolling as quickly, effectively. So where in 5 minutes, this is hypothetical, but in 5 minutes, 1,000 transfer in a neurotypical brain. With an ADHD person in 5 minutes, only 100 might have transferred of these vesicles moving across. And it's really important then to have strategies in place where you can think, how can I get myself to get motivated? Because once it's rolling, you're transferring loads of dopamine just like everyone else. But the initiation is super hard.
I find that so interesting to know. And again, it's just providing the scientific information behind what's going on in our brains that I think can alleviate a lot of the negative talk that we have with ourselves of being like, you're so hopeless, you're so lazy, you know, you can't get going. And a lot of the bad sides of ADHD has a lot to do with negative self-talk. And finding out things like that to me, it just alleviates that weight a little bit.
Yeah, like the judgment that you can have.
Yeah, because there's a reason for it. You know, it's not an
Yeah.
excuse. You still have to put the strategies in place to manage your own life and the people around you so that they're not negatively affected. But I think it just gives you the permission to be a little bit softer on yourself. Something else that I'm interested in is how dopamine may be linked with impulsivity and a desire for novelty.
Yeah. Novelty is the whole of dopamine. Like, as this chemical is evolving within us as humans, the whole chemical evolved for our survival to increase the likelihood of humans surviving, which meant our shelter and our food supply, basically. And you'd be traversing a forest or a jungle or the bush in Australia.
It's a bit more dangerous here.
Yeah, it is more. You'd be paying attention here. And any novel experiences in our environment would trigger a dopamine release. So say you're walking along and then you see like a fruit tree, like bananas or something on a tree, you'd then get an increase of dopamine, which would be like the anticipatory dopamine to then drive you towards the tree to get the fruit. And then say you saw an animal that you might be able to eat or hunt or whatever it might be, anything novel in our environment would increase our desire to engage with that behavior in order to find the behavior so that we would survive. And where the difficulty is in the modern world is there is so much novelty. Like you can pick up the vape, that's novelty. You can go on TikTok, then you can change to WhatsApp, then change to Instagram, then have some sugar. And effectively, because we're in these lower dopamine states with ADHD, or you've just overgenerated it and crashed it out as a neurotypical brain, you're in these low dopamine states. And then the excitement of, oh, there's some fruit or there's some food. It's not like 2 or 3 times a day you might be able to access dopamine like we had evolutionarily. It's like thousands of times a day you could technically engage with it. And you go through these big ups and downs. And if you're in low dopamine, you're ridiculously impulsive, effectively. Your ability to make good, smart decisions that are good for your long term are less. And that's why, for example, if you get really drunk, you wake up and your desire to make yourself a nice healthy breakfast versus order some crap on Uber Eats is suddenly different to the rest of the week. It's like, nope, I'm ordering the Uber Eats. I don't even care about my health. It's like, it's very different when you're low in dopamine after the drinking. And the difficulty in the modern world is the phone is really crashing the dopamine out. So then our impulsivity with everything is on the rise. If we took the phone out of the equation, we'd only be engaging with the quick dopamine, like occasionally when we get drunk or occasionally when we eat the bad food. But the phone is more like 200 or 300 dopamine hits a day. So it's like a big factor for ADHD.
TJ, I've got to tell you this, and I'm aware enough that it is going to sound creepy, but often when I wake up in the morning, I have started thinking of you.
Nice.
And it's because I've seen a lot of your content about waking up in the morning and the first thing that you do is roll over and you look at your phone and you turn off your alarm and you check your messages. And for me, being very truthful, I am a bit of a like pick your poison kind of person. You know, we can't expect perfection, but let's try and make these little tweaks. It is the one tweak I have not been able to kick yet.
Yeah.
And I kind of laugh at myself. The other day, you know, I knew that this conversation was coming up and I woke up to my alarm and I had a little bit of extra time in the morning to what I needed. And I was thinking about this conversation and thinking about what we were going to talk about. And then by the time I kind of finished my phone scroll, 45 minutes had passed. And I was like, man, how am I going to tell TJ this? How am I going to tell him that even with all of the knowledge and all of the things that he talks about all the time about phone fasting and just doing other things in the morning, I'm still failing at it.
Firstly, there's just no judgment. Like, you wake up in the morning, obviously it's nice to scroll a phone. Like, it's a pleasurable experience. I love going on Instagram. Like, later today, I'll be going on it and I'll love going on there. So, like, it's not a bad thing to want it.
I don't even, like, as bad as it sounds, I know that it's because it's pleasurable, but I've somehow convinced myself it's actually that I'm kind of like checking things first. You know, very, very, very rarely I will wake up to an email because we have a lot of international guests on the podcast.
Oh, yeah, we actually laughed on DM the other night because I know I shouldn't be on Instagram at that time and you were like, I shouldn't be either.
I was like, well, I was able to get away with it because you were on a different time zone, so you didn't know what time it was here. But often, you know, I'll go through my emails and I'll check Instagram messages and I'll check all these things and I'll convince myself it's because that's going to set my day up right, you know, because if someone's cancelled or like I'll need to kind of rally the troops and make some adjustments to what the day's going to look like. The reality is that's probably happened less than 10 times in my entire career.
Yeah.
But I'm just in this habit of like checking off the notifications and it almost makes me feel like, okay, well, that's a clean slate now and now I can get going. Why is that so bad and how can I change it?
The brain just needs a period of time, like a short period of time before it accesses this more quick dopamine in order to have a lot of natural dopamine generating all day. Like I also need to wake up and do all my messages, my Instagram and my email and WhatsApp and so on. But the game plan is just to try and like slightly extend the amount of time before you head in there. And effectively, when you wake up in the morning, the brain is craving the dopamine. Whatever its first source of dopamine is going to instinctively crave in that direction for the rest of the day. It's going to think of that as its primary source. So if it got it from anything that was an effortful action, your brain is going to be slightly more oriented towards, today I'm going to put effort into my day.
Wow.
Whereas if it gets primed by, I can get quick dopamine, that's going to be its priority. Its source is going to be like social media or a vape or sugar, whatever was that initial source when you woke. And if we can just delay it by 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning, it's extremely valuable. And this comes from a place of like, I did that for 10, 15 years or something. Like I was always waking up and scrolling on my phone. And I started having this idea of like, maybe if I could naturally generate dopamine first thing, maybe it would impact my day. And then I started doing it and the impact was just insane. And we run something called the Dose Lab, which is like this research lab that people are members of and they come to our events and stuff like that. And a lot of people come to us for phone addiction. That's probably the primary thing people join Dose for, is phone addiction. And then we go on to explore loads of stuff, food and relationships and productivity. But it starts with phone addiction. And people will come to us with like 7 to 9 hour a day screen times, like pretty high screen times.
Who would have that?
Who would have that? Lots of like, and like, again, like there's no judgment for these screen times. It's super addictive. And I initially was like, how the hell am I going to get these numbers down? Like I want people to join and immediately experience that number reducing so they feel like it's a good thing to be doing, to be a part of Dose. And we just start with changing that beginning, that first 5 to 10 minutes, which obviously it's not 5 to 10 minutes less screen time. That wouldn't be that different on their 9 hours a day. But people start with that 5 to 10 difference. And within like a few weeks, they've gone from 7 hours a day to 3 hours a day, only because they've changed the beginning, because they've developed the ability to not have it first thing. They haven't primed the brain for the addiction. And then they've primed their brain for today's going to be effort. Today I'm going to exercise. I'm going to get outside. I'm going to work. I'm going to connect with people. And then suddenly there's this huge knock-on effect of the phone reducing throughout the day.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a huge difference.
It's crazy.
A lot more than I thought could be achieved.
Yeah. And we don't even give them that many other tips. We only do the start one. And then they have this like new relationship forming with their phone whereby they're the one in charge of when they go on it. Because the beginning of the day is when you want it the absolute most. And then if you've successfully beaten that moment of desire, your capacity to beat it again and again and again throughout the day is increasing. So suddenly all the times throughout work and everything that you would have gone on it, it's all reducing. So the number is rapidly falling.
Right. So you said 5 to 10 minutes. So, I mean, logistically, what does that look like for you? Do you have an alarm clock that's not a phone?
Yeah, I do really believe in having an alarm clock. Like I use these like Lumi sunrise alarm clocks, which wake you with 30 minutes of light.
Not sponsored.
Not sponsored. I use
But could
these
be.
non-Lumi alarm clocks that are something like a sunrise alarm clock. I actually am not sponsored by them, but I think they're a great product.
They should sponsor you.
They will in time. But I think that's great. I think if you don't want to like buy like a fancy alarm clock, you could just like get like a £2 one off Amazon that just makes a sound. But you really can't resist the phone if the phone is the alarm. Like you're going to click it, maybe a few days, you're like, oh, I'm so motivated, I listened to that podcast, I'm not going to go on it. But eventually you're going to think, oh, fuck it. And then you're going straight into the phone. So not having the phone charging by the bed is absolutely essential. Then for me, like I wake up, I really struggle with snoozing. Like I'd love to just like snooze for like 2 hours and just not get up. And what I do is in that moment, I immediately, my girlfriend finds this almost weird, but I immediately like sit by the side of my bed. Like I get out and I sit on the side so that I can't go back to sleep. And I'll sit there for 2, 3, 4 minutes, like trying to get myself to stand up basically, but I just won't let myself go back to sleep.
Mel Robbins does this. Have you seen her
Interesting.
videos of her sliding out of her bed? Like quite literally sliding out of her bed.
Interesting.
Because she has ADHD as well. She does this thing where she will force herself to literally slip out of bed because she finds that once she's out of the bed, you know, you got to do something. And no matter how long that process takes, she kind of says about like laying on the floor and then very gradually turning onto your side, sitting up, step by step of just getting out of bed.
And each of those moments of difficulty are then building the dopamine naturally, which is your whole goal. With ADHD, your whole goal is how can I naturally generate more of this chemical? So I'll sit there. Eventually I'll be like, okay, I'm going to go to the bathroom. And then I go to the bathroom and I immediately start brushing my teeth because it's like an annoying, boring activity that I don't love to do. And that's generating dopamine. then splash cold water on my face. Cold water is really, really good. Like ice baths are very good for dopamine. Even the simplicity of cold water hitting your face is great. I'll go to the bathroom, I'll come back, I'll make the bed. And like I try and basically have this period of effort. And I don't enjoy the period. I don't say this from like a perspective of I would rather do this than scroll my phone. But I know the impact is so massive. And for me, I've then gradually extended. I really try and have quite a long time before I go on the phone. Like I now do like an hour before I go on it because it's really transformational. But I recommend people start with 5 to 10 minutes, then they go on it. But the longer you wait before you go on that phone, the better your day is going to go, 100%.
Yeah. And how did you feel like in comparison of when you were exactly like me, who would scroll for 45 minutes without even realizing, in comparison to having an hour before you're on your phone? How do you feel?
I really struggled with like procrastination and getting myself just to take action on what I needed to do. So like I needed to do my work, or I needed to go for a walk, or I needed to like do whatever. And I always thought that was just like a trait that was who I was. So therefore like life is more difficult for me. And I just believe that's who I was. And as I became really clear on what dopamine actually was, I realized I was more in control of my ability to get myself to initiate action than I realized. And I realized that my ability to initiate action was based on how many of these dopamine balls is sitting in my brain. And in my head, I have this idea of like, if I go straight into the phone, I'm going to have very few of these balls left in my brain that are then going to enable me to go and do the thing that I need to do, the thing that I don't want to do effectively. So then I know that in the morning, if I do follow that structure when I wake up, I'm building some of this dopamine. If I go out for a walk, the sunlight is incredible, the walking is incredible, nature's incredible, and I'm generating a ton of this chemical. And then when I come back from that walk, I've got this like abundance of dopamine in my brain, which then means taking action feels much easier. And previously I thought I just couldn't take action. But really I realized it was actually I was in like a low dopamine deficit state, and that was causing me to not take action. So it was really like empowering for me because I went from this like really procrastinating person to a very motivated person just on that difference in structure when I woke up.
That's really interesting because I relate in the sense that I've always joked that I'm not the type of person who can do meditation. I love yoga like everybody else, and I have heard you speak about something that when I actually think about doing that to myself, and it's only ever happened to me by accident because a battery will have gone flat or it started raining, you go for a walk and you deliberately don't put headphones in.
Yeah, hell.
I think about doing that and I'm like, oh, absolutely not. Why would I even want to do that to myself?
And why would you not want to? And this is good for you to be honest, because people will relate.
I think because, I mean, obviously I have a bit of a ping pong brain.
Yeah.
And I know that, in the meditation that you're supposed to do in yoga, all I do is create to-do lists and think about the things that I could be doing rather than just laying there wasting time. And I'm putting wasting time in quotation marks for anyone who's only listening. I guess it's that I've conditioned myself to the point where I feel like I need that distraction to enjoy what I'm doing, whether it be the walk, whether even grocery stores. I can find that kind of thing a little bit overstimulating. And I think that for people with ADHD, that can be the case in different environments. Also, autistic people can experience that overstimulating effect. But yeah, headphones to me, I mean, I love podcasts. I get so much enjoyment out of it. So I guess I've married the two things, whether it be that exercise by itself is kind of boring, so at least I'll get to enjoy this. Mark Manson spoke on the podcast about how he doesn't like cleaning, so he'll make sure that he saves a podcast that he's looking forward to.
Ah, clever.
And he's kind of gamified it, right? He's made it a bit more fun for himself that he's only allowed to listen to that podcast when he does the task that he doesn't really want to do. And I get like, I do like walking though. Like I do like getting out and exercising, but I enjoy it a lot more when I've got something to listen to. And I know that that is probably creating a bit of a feedback loop in my brain that is almost insatiable, and I know that I have to get better at boredom, and I know that I have to be more comfortable in a lower stimulating environment.
Yeah.
I don't want to start. How did you start it?
Honestly, just to put into context as to how much I relate to that idea. When I was, 15, I got like an iPad mini and I had Friends on it. The TV show had all 10 seasons of Friends. And from 15 to maybe 22, I literally never spent time in the quiet. I've probably seen every Friends episode 50 times because I was just cycling it all the time, just listening to Friends, always headphones in. And I'd have it on my phone. I'd always just listen to that TV show and it would quiet that noise in my head. And I remember this time at university, I was like 21 years old or so, and I was in the library at university, which was about a 15-minute walk from my house. And my phone was out of battery and I didn't have the iPad with me. And I remember thinking like, wow, 15 minutes in this head of mine is not going to fly. So I actually remember thinking I can't do it. And I carried my laptop with like Spotify playing with my headphones plugged into it. And I just walked all the way home with my like big chunky laptop in my hand just to not have that noise start. So like I really relate to how hard it can be to be in the quiet. The big thing I discovered is it's so noisy in there because we're not spending any time in the quiet. And if you had like a cupboard in your house where you dump all your shit and you just always shut it effectively, and you open it sometimes and you think, oh my God, that cupboard is hell. It's like never ever go in there. Effectively, for our thoughts, that's very similar to what we're doing. Like we know how noisy it is, how like messy it is effectively in there. So we just leave the door shut. We never go to the quiet and open the door up. If you start going on these walks in nature without your headphones, initially, just as starting to clean that cupboard, it is quite uncomfortable. It's like, wow, this is pretty rapid. My thoughts are quite noisy. I'm worried about that. And what does that person think of me? And I need to be more successful. And like all this shit that pours through your head. But as you clean that cupboard progressively, you would start to feel quite like a cathartic, nice feeling as a result of getting it nice and organized. Each of these walks is effectively cleaning that thought process out, and it gets quieter and quieter. And I went from, over like a short period of time, I had this desire to wake up and not go on the phone and go on these walks. And I went at the beginning and it was hell. It was so loud. And each day it was getting quieter and quieter. And effectively I was like organizing that big messy room. And it then reached a point where walking in the quiet felt really comfortable and actually became not like a horrible chore that I had to do to try and clear out my mind, but actually the most like beautiful place where I was having really grateful thoughts for my life, and I was having all of these ideas for dose. Like I wouldn't have any of this information really without that time in the quiet, because it was my time to properly creatively think about how I wanted to have an impact on the world and so on. And the big thing to know is it can get quiet. It's just like a time frame. And we have like this almost boredom barrier that we like never go past. And if you go past it, there's actually a lot of peace out there in the quiet, even if you're super noisy in your head.
That's very interesting. And I think it's one of those things that I know I need to work on. Like I really, it is actually at the top of the list of, we've joked on Life Uncut many, many times that, you know, people will write in and say, how does Keisha have the time to listen to this amount of podcasts and stuff? And it's because I have 3 pairs of headphones. I've got 2 pairs of AirPods and I've got AirPod Max. And I have a speaker that it's waterproof. And I bought that speaker so that I could listen to something in the shower. Like I'm bad in this way. I don't have quiet and I don't have chill. And
I so understand.
It's almost like I get to the end of the day, and if it is a quiet environment, I feel uncomfortable in that. And so I really do need to take your advice in this.
Do you have any nature near you where you live?
Yep, absolutely.
I would say only do the quiet thing in the nature whilst walking. I don't think just like sitting on the sofa in the quiet, especially for an ADHD brain, is actually going to be conducive to calming you down. I think when you're in the nature, you have this big rise of serotonin, which is like our mood molecule, which has a really stabilizing effect on our nervous system, and it calms our brain. And in the nature, you're then having the serotonin increase, and your capacity to navigate through all that sporadic thinking is a lot better. In terms of in the next week, like, do you think you could have an hour where you could walk in nature? Like, can you see that as a possible scenario?
Only because we've had this conversation. I'm the closest thing that we have in our team to a biohack bro. I love an ice bath. I really focus on sleep. And I started walking to the ice bath and the sauna place.
Okay.
And I was actually listening to you, another conversation that you had, a podcast episode, the other day when I was in the sauna and I was in the ice bath.
Yeah.
And I remember I went to Bali a couple of months ago, and we went to one of these like ice bath sauna retreat kind of places. I'm very woo-woo, guys.
I love it.
And I was in the ice bath, and I've built myself up to it. Like I can be in there for 7 degrees around 4 and a bit minutes. Like
that is impressive.
Well, it didn't start there, you know, and so that's why I like these things where you start small and you gradually build it up.
Yeah.
But in the ice bath, it was one of those ones where quite a few people could fit in it at the same time. And I was the only one in there with headphones. And I'd almost convinced myself like, well, it's not a pleasurable experience being in 7 degrees. So you're going to be able to last longer if you are distracted, if you're interested in the conversation that you're listening to. Or I can even sometimes get work email. I've tried to send emails in the sauna and in the ice bath just to kind of let that time pass. I don't think I'll be able to do the sauna or the ice bath without stimulation yet, but I reckon I could walk there.
Nice.
Like, I think I could walk to the place without having it
Stimulation-free.
in. You know what I mean? So I'm going to try and make these small adjustments based off of your advice to try and help my brain with the way it's processing dopamine.
The only motivating thing I'd say on the sauna in the cold with the distraction is the benefit isn't just like completely logical in terms of I'm in the cold, so benefit is occurring. The benefit is increased dependent on the quantity of pain you're actually experiencing. So the more uncomfortable you are in cold water, the more dopamine you're actually generating. So if you're trying to make it more comfortable, it's actually not as good.
I've jinxed my own system.
You'd almost be better doing 2 minutes of hell than 4 minutes of distracted kind of hell.
Okay.
And that being said, if it was none or distracted cold water, definitely distracted cold water. But if you can motivate yourself in that way that we actually want painful experiences, like life as a human being for hundreds of thousands of years was very physically painful. And if you can give yourself painful experiences, obviously in a nice way, like cold or sauna, then it's actually advantageous to the brain.
Is there any research on things like, I mean, I kind of toy in this area because I am science-based, but I like to use alternate therapies as well.
Nice.
And like I said, ice baths, saunas. Is there science on what that does to our dopamine?
In terms of cold and sauna?
Yeah.
Yeah, so cold is extremely good for the dopamine system. Dopamine is actually very interconnected with adrenaline. Adrenaline and dopamine are like cousins, effectively, in the brain and body. And when you have an extremely adrenaline increasing experience, you get accompanied dopamine coming with it. And that's why when you have people that are called adrenaline junkies, like they get hooked on like jumping out of planes and skydiving, they're actually not adrenaline junkies. It's dopamine that they're getting addicted to. They're dopamine junkies, but it's adrenaline that's being like associated with it because we just like think of extreme activities as adrenaline. And when you're in that cold water, your brain has this moment of perceiving potential danger. Like as a hunter-gatherer, if you were suddenly thrown into a freezing cold moving river, your brain would need to wake up very, very rapidly. So adrenaline would wake it up, but then dopamine would come in as well to get it very motivated and focused on survival so that your attention is sharp so you can see a way out of the river or whatever it may be. So in that scenario with the cold, you're getting adrenaline and dopamine. Fantastic. It can 2.5 times your dopamine level when you're in those cold environments, which is a massive increase. That's almost comparable to like alcohol and cocaine.
Wow. Does it last?
Yeah, the interesting thing is with something like alcohol, it will 2 times our dopamine, and it will get to that point within 15 minutes of drinking it, and then it will rapidly fall, which is why you have your first drink and it's like, wow, this is the best thing ever. And then 15 minutes later, you're like, are we having more drinks? Like, am I getting some more of this into my system?
Whose round is it?
Yeah, whose round is it? Because your brain can see that dip is coming, and then it's like, I don't want that dip, so it gets more. Cocaine will 2.5 times the dopamine, so it goes even higher. It will do that within 9 minutes of interacting with cocaine, which is an even more rapid increase, big fall, which is why you'd really rapidly engage with it. With the cold water immersion, it's activating an entirely different part of the brain. It's activating a much more survival, painful part of the brain. And you'll see that dopamine last for about 2.5 hours in the brain. So the cold water in the morning, super valuable, especially for ADHD, because you're raising the amount of this natural dopamine generation, then getting yourself to take action on your work or whatever it might be, something hard is going to be easier.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
All right, I'll keep ice bathing in the mornings.
So cold is dopamine. On the heat side of things, it's actually more endorphins based, and endorphins evolved to really help us cope with stress in our mind and physical pain in our body. In a situation where like a bear was chasing you, we needed a chemical that very rapidly would de-stress the brain and take stressful thoughts out of our brain so that we were focused on survival. So you weren't like running around like, oh my God, I'm going to die. You were just like, boom, in the zone. How am I surviving? And endorphins basically would release when our body was in big, extreme physical action. And when you're in a sauna, you'll notice at like 10 minutes or so, your body starts to really struggle with that experience. Like it's like, wow, I want to get out of here. This is hurting. Like your thoughts like, get me out of it. In that moment, when you're in that physical discomfort, your brain's perceiving that similar level of danger and endorphins are releasing. And our modern world, we're very, very stressed out by all these different stimuli in our world. And the more you can get yourself into these saunas, the more of a de-stressing effect you're going to have. And the more you're able to actually tolerate the stress that's coming.
Interesting. How does sleep have an effect on our dopamine production?
Sleep would, if you were picking one chemical, sleep would be a little bit more serotonin oriented, which is like the mood energy level chemical. but it also does have a restorative effect on dopamine. So you're kind of generating both of them, dopamine and serotonin. And the sleep thing in ADHD is actually really interesting. Andrew Huberman, who's obviously like an amazing neuroscientist that many are familiar with, has started really talking about how much of a relationship there is between our circadian rhythm and ADHD. Your circadian rhythm being your sleep-wake cycle. Initially, it was completely governed by lights. Like the sun came up, we woke up, the sun went down, we went to sleep. And it was like a very succinct operating system. And now with the advent of artificial light, like our whole circadian rhythm is extremely confused. And it's really clear that people with ADHD that begin to get more consistent with their bedtime, their wake time, their meal times, their amount of sunlight they get in the morning, their ADHD symptoms begin to reduce. So the sleep is a really pivotal factor.
Yeah, I've actually noticed that just within myself, anecdotally again, that other than medication, sleep is the one thing that really, really alleviates my symptoms of ADHD. Like if I'm waking up tired, if I've had a shocking sleep the night before, it will be worse than if I've had really high sugar, if I've been drinking alcohol, like all of those things. Sleep is by far the biggest impactor for me. And that might just be my brain, but from friends that I've spoken to who also have ADHD, they seem to have this similar kind of relationship, I guess, with sleep. It's something that a lot of us really struggle with, especially if you add in the things like the scrolling at nighttime.
sure.
And, there is a little bit of talk about whether we have a different kind of natural circadian rhythm and time that we like to sleep. And I don't know how much that is backed by science or not. But I guess it's one of these things that I'm like, again, it's just good to be aware of these things so that we can try and make little habit changes in our life. And I caught up with Dr. Kieran Kennedy, who is a psychiatrist that has joined us on Cloud over the weekend. And we were talking about this conversation.
Cool.
And he's right into health and fitness. And Kieran and I were talking about nutrition and how, certain diets, certain, foods and processed foods can impact attention and to a further extent ADHD. And that was when I thought, we're in a really fortunate position with this because I'm chatting with TJ in the next couple of days and his girlfriend, Georgia, is a clinical nutritionist. And so I asked you, hey, do you reckon we could do a bit of a everyone joins in together? And I would love to welcome Georgia Farah to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, Georgia, are there certain types of foods that I guess can be better or worse for maintaining focus and attention?
Definitely. So you definitely want to focus on like your protein-rich foods because they contain the amino acids which are the building blocks for things like dopamine, particularly tyrosine. So tyrosine is a building block for dopamine. So if you're increasing your protein-rich foods like turkey, chicken, beef, etc., it's going to help with the dopamine.
Have there been studies that have shown that that has an impact on sustained focus, I guess? I mean, I guess I'm trying to compare it to these, we've spoken a lot in this conversation, TJ, about these kind of rushes of dopamine versus, more prolonged extended release dopamine. Is there a food equivalent?
Yeah, there is. If you're increasing your protein, it's going to also stabilize your blood sugars. And in terms of for people with ADHD or anxiety, basically if they're consuming a higher glycemic diet, which I mean like high carbohydrates, it's going to be throwing out their blood sugars and it's going to be affecting their ability to concentrate because when your blood sugars are rapidly increasing and then decreasing, it can also like mimic symptoms like irritability. And I'm sure we've all experienced feeling extremely hangry. So it definitely affects ability for somebody to concentrate.
Everyone can actually think of a time where you've gotten home at the end of the day and you're so hungry and you're so depleted and you rush to the cupboard and grab whatever you can. For me, it's always like an Anzac cookie or something that's just going to get that sugar back up there. And it works for 20 minutes and then you feel like shit. And I have absolutely tried to make these things work hand in hand. When I'm trying to improve my lifestyle and all of the things to do with ADHD, I really have noticed that sugar is the one thing that can absolutely fuck me up. Like it can just put me onto these really, really bad pathways where, I don't know, I guess I'm impulsively seeking another rush and another high. And I guess
more dopamine vesicles.
Definitely.
Getting it back in there. So I guess we've spoken about what would be the good things for ADHD or for people who struggle with focus and attention being protein. What would be some of the worst things that we could consume?
So definitely ultra-processed foods
Okay.
because they bypass our leptin and ghrelin. So they're our two hunger hormones. And basically ghrelin, it will say, hey, I'm hungry, please start eating, like I need you to eat. with ultra-processed foods is they increase ghrelin. And then we have leptin, and leptin's like, hey, I'm full, please stop eating. What happens with ultra-processed foods is it increases ghrelin and it doesn't activate leptin. So your body hasn't registered that, hey, I'm full, stop eating. So then it drives this overeating kind of cycle. And you've also got the dopamine desensitization with sugar. So increasing your consumption of sugar is going to desensitize dopamine, leading your brain to like needing constant reward. So you're going to be back in that pantry seeking for more and more sugar.
What would be some examples of ultra processed food for people who don't know?
Yeah, so ultra processed foods are things that they're combined with like fats, sugars, high amounts of sodium. So things like chips, ice cream, and even like protein bars, they're destroying our gut. A lot of them. There are some clean ones out there on the market, but a lot of them do contain like emulsifiers and additives and things that do bypass these hunger hormones. So it's really important to just try your best to look at the food that you're eating and think, hey, where does this food come from? Does it come from the ground? Does it come from, an animal source, etc.? And if you're turning, the back of a product that you're eating, looking at the ingredients and there's like an array of different ingredients that you're unaware of, I think that's when you should start, questioning, should I be eating this?
Can I add something on this protein and the sugar for you as
Yeah.
well? Because I have had a really interesting experience of entering a relationship with Georgia and then the impact it's had on my food. And I love those dopamine hits as well. I always have really liked sugary yogurts, like any kind of yogurts that can give me a bit of stimulation. And you can kind of fool yourself with the yogurt as well because it will say 20 grams of protein. So you're like, oh, it's good for me, this chocolate mousse, because it says 20 grams of protein on the front.
And it's fermented, and I'm
Yeah.
told
And
that's
you're
good
like,
for my
that's
gut
amazing.
microbiome.
All the
And,
marketing.
my craving for these things was just really strong. Like I'd finish a meal and I'd always have really strong cravings for sugar. And Georgia explained this whole framework to me that protein itself has a really strong impact on dopamine because there's this amino acid in it called tyrosine, which then builds our dopamine chemical and it makes our dopamine more satisfied effectively. And I also like eating steak. I think steak's amazing. I like eating eggs. And suddenly it was more on the cards that I was allowed steak and eggs at the beginning of the day. And I was like, what? Steak and eggs at the beginning of the day? That sounds crazy to be able to have that. The protein itself actually then satisfies your desire for food so much more than anything else. And to give you a scenario, if you have a pizza in front of you, you can just keep eating it. You can eat an unlimited amount of pizza. If you have a steak in front of you, although it's delicious, eventually you're like, I don't really want any more steak. You very quickly kind of satiate, you feel full. And we've tried to move towards a much higher protein diet where eggs and steak and chicken are real priorities in our meals so that we can build a lot more of this tyrosine and dopamine. And the impact it's then had on my cravings has been out of this world. My actual desire for the quick dopamine food is reducing as a result of pursuing the higher dopamine diet, which has been super transformative as an addict.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Georgia, do you have any examples of those high protein foods? Most of what we're talking about are meat
Yep.
or dairy products, both of which I happily consume. But
Yeah.
for anyone who is maybe vegetarian, pescatarian, or vegan,
Yeah.
what are some other high protein sources
So
that they could go to?
You could definitely do things like beans and legumes, tofu, tempeh, etc.
Fish as well, that's
Fi-
for pescatarians.
Yeah,
would
fish
be
for
amazing.
pescatarians is incredible. Omega-3 is extremely important for people with ADHD as well. A lot of people with ADHD have lower plasma omega-3 levels.
Wow.
So it's really important to help to stabilize the brain and to support that brain to focus. Omega-3 from fish. So if you are vegan, I definitely would recommend an algae supplement if you're not getting enough omega-3 and you are somebody who does present ADHD type symptoms, because it does help to support the brain. The brain is made of 60% DHA, and that's a part of the omega-3. So really, really important
Absolutely
for ADHD
necessary.
people. Yeah.
What other supplements or vitamins or minerals could someone who has problems with attention or has ADHD? I keep on saying these two things because some people listening to the podcast, they may not have ADHD. They might have someone in their life that they love that has ADHD. But I think all of these things can, even if you don't have ADHD,
Yeah.
we all struggle with attention and
We
focus
do.
now, So
100%.
it's kind of a little bit for either or. What things should we be looking for increasing in our diet?
Yeah. So I would definitely recommend magnesium.
Okay.
Magnesium is extremely important, especially when you are somebody with ADHD. You are more in that sympathetic nervous system. You're quite overactive and
We're wired.
Yeah, wired up, ready to rock.
which is great. It's amazing. But you do want that calm nervous system, and magnesium is really important for a lot of our neurotransmitters. It is a cofactor for a lot of them. So you want to be eating things like hemp seeds, dark chocolate, plus 70% dark is good, and things like chia seeds, oats, etc.
Do you get
bananas.
magnesium in any of the meats and eggs or no?
Yeah, meat is fantastic. In terms of meat, if you can eat meat, it's a great source of like magnesium and, like I said before, the building blocks for tyrosine, which will help with dopamine. Green tea is another thing that you can also do because it contains L-theanine, and L-theanine is really calming for the brain.
Okay.
And it also helps with like focus and cognition. So if you're starting like a task, it'd be really good if you could have something like a green tea prior or during, because that will help just to, relax the brain, but also help with that cognitive state.
My last question for you, Georgia, is to do with the way that our society has kind of created breakfast foods. And there was actually a really interesting chapter with Johan Hari in his book Stolen Focus, and it was about ADHD, and he'd spoken to a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists. But there was an interesting part in there that I thought, wow, that's something that we really probably should be addressing. And it was the fact that all of our breakfast foods are marketed mostly towards children and, families, and you start your day with a breakfast cereal. And if you turn the packet around and you look at what's on the back of it, it's a load of rubbish.
I know.
What are your thoughts on things like high-sugared cereals, and why are they so
Yeah.
bad?
Terrible. Basically, we have this neuropeptide called neuropeptide Y. And if you were to start your day with a high amount of sugar, that's going to increase rapidly throughout your day. So you're going to constantly seek out for sugar for the rest of your day. That's just by your first meal. So that increases neuropeptide Y. However, if you change that scenario and you started your morning off with 25 grams plus of protein, it's going to increase this other peptide called neuropeptide YY. So different. But what it's going to do is it's basically going to decrease your desire for sugar and create fullness. It's basically like a natural appetite suppressant. So the sugary cereal is really basically driving us to overeat throughout that whole day. It's throwing out our blood sugars. It's creating irritability. People start off with like this high sugar meal. They're getting this rapid increase in their blood sugars. They feel on top of the moon. 20 minutes, an hour later, boom, they crash. And then they sit at their desk and they're like, how am I supposed to work? I can't focus. So these foods are really not what we are supposed to be eating as humans. And in 1985, the tobacco industry actually purchased a lot of the big ultra-processed food companies, so like Kraft, etc. They purchased them, and they've had clever people to come in and design these foods to be highly addictive. So it's really, really important that we understand that this is what this is. I guess in my eyes, to be honest, if I'm being completely honest with you, I don't see it as food. I think it's
Manufactured.
It's really interesting this, because George and I have had a lot of discussions on this, because saying to not eat ultra processed foods could be playing into diet culture and suggesting you're restrictive eating. And
Correct.
we really don't want to say people should do like restrictive eating, because we're aware of all the multitude of challenges that creates. But if you don't eat the ultra processed foods, you don't really binge eat or starve yourself at all, because you can't binge eat these ultra processed foods, and you get such natural stabilized hunger hormones that you naturally eat in really good rhythms. And I don't think it should be seen as restrictive eating to not have them. I think really restrictive eating would be not letting yourself eat dinner, and even if your dinner was going to be healthy, that would be restrictive eating. But I really struggled with all this stuff for like 10 years, and I thought I could never not do it. And very rapidly, if you take the ultra processed foods out your diet, your brain's like dopamine relationship and desire for them all begins to very quickly reduce. And you can still have things that are stimulating. Like we get good quality honey and put it on the yogurt, and I still eat it having that like sugary experience, but it's not an ultra processed food. And really, like with all the research we read, it seems humans just need to like fully try and cut it. It seems possible. You can always buy like the cheaper version. It's great if you get your organic grass fed, but if you can just get like the cheaper beef mince or like the cheaper eggs, it's still going to be a lot better for your brain than eating the ultra processed foods, 100%.
I completely agree. And I think, again, it's similar to the conversation we had, must be about an hour ago now. I'm not sure how long we've been chatting for, but I don't aim for perfection. I don't
Yeah.
aim for these things in absolutes. I know that people with ADHD can be a little bit all or nothing. And when
Yeah,
I've
for
got
sure.
motivation behind things, like, yes, I will do it to the nth degree. But as I'm adjusting my lifestyle to try and, I guess counteract some of the bad sides of ADHD, I'm just aiming for little tiny improvements that I can make so that I can
Amazing.
feel better. And it has really been a really wonderful process. Like if I compare it to a year ago, the way that I used to eat was very, very different. And I didn't know it was linked to my, novelty seeking, and it was linked to my impulsivity. And I guess also like a lot of people with ADHD, we're really bad planners. Like we're not the ones doing food prep on a Sunday. I can say that right now.
I would hate to food prep on a Sunday. That sounds like the worst idea.
It's the most boring thing I could
I'm
ever.
not food prepping.
That or going for a walk for an hour without
I'm
headphones.
sorry, but this
like-
is gonna help. This is gonna help.
Pick your poison. I just realized that I have one more question, and I'm not
Yeah.
sure which one of you I would like to target
Yeah.
this at,
Yeah.
but it's caffeine.
Yeah.
Is it good? Is it bad? Is it good for people with ADHD? When should we be having it?
Ooh. So caffeine does have a big impact on dopamine. That's one of the reasons it's so pleasurable to consume it. And that's also one of the reasons it can sharpen your focus. Like if you have a coffee and then you immediately work, you might notice you have like an enhanced capacity to do that task. Like anything, it's just if you really start to overdo the caffeine consumption, you're going to overstimulate the dopamine, which ultimately causes less dopamine. Yeah, I think it's so good if you can not have your caffeine when you first wake. If you like, that's can't become like quite a phenomenon now. But if you can wait a little bit, if you can go outside before you have your coffee and stuff like that, and then when you have your coffee, see it as like a performance enhancement drug, effectively, and think of it as I'm going to have my coffee when I'm just about to get in the zone. Like today, for example, I would have loved to have a coffee when I woke up, but I knew if I had my coffee just before I walked into this podcast, it's going to elevate my dopamine, and then my capacity to get in the zone and focus is going to be enhanced from that coffee. If I'd had it when I woke, 2 hours later when I was on this podcast, I might have actually been experiencing the dip, and then my ability to concentrate would reduce. So I would say it can be good for dopamine. You want to use it as a performance enhancer and do something hard after having it, and you don't want to have tons of it.
Caffeine contains polyphenols, so
Okay.
antioxidants, and there's lots of studies to show that they're amazing for our brain. It does help with cognitive function in that way because of the antioxidant properties of caffeine. So in terms of having your coffee, I definitely would delay it and try and have it like after you've had food. And the reason I say that is because caffeine increases cortisol. Cortisol is also interlinked with your like glucose metabolism. So it can interfere with our blood sugars as well and create that rapid, spike and crash and then leave us kind of feeling a bit. So I would suggest having it after you've had some food, something in your tummy.
Okay, good to know.
Protein, then coffee, then hard work. If from this entire conversation, all someone tried to make a shift on was phone first thing in the morning and high protein breakfast, if you just finished the conversation, just made those two, I say just, like it's actually two pretty hard things to tweak. But if you started with that, reducing the phone in the morning and a high protein breakfast, like that's all you would need to remember from this conversation. And for someone with ADHD, that over time would have a phenomenal impact.
Also, people with ADHD love headlines, so we love the bullet points.
Yeah.
This.
Those are the
You
bullet
don't need
points.
the details. That's it.
Don't worry about everything else we said.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. I've been so excited for this conversation. It's been better than I ever could have imagined. TJ's new book, The Dose Effect, is available. You can find links to his website, his book, and his Instagram in our show notes. And George's social media will also be linked there too, so you can find out a lot more about ultra-processed foods there. I really enjoy your content. So from both of you, thank you so much for connecting from the other side of the world and coming to Australia to record.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.